A look at Los Angeles Airways, 1947 through 1963. LA Airways started operations on October 1st, 1947 as a suburban inter-connecting feeder service. In making the initial award, the CAB said, in part, we do not believe that its present high cost of operation alone should deter this experiment, since a more economical helicopter may be anticipated just as more economical conventional aircraft have been developed. In view of the present equipment picture, the board's assumption was correct. 5 Sikorsky's S-51 started LA Airways service, which was originally limited to carry the mail. LAA flew the first Air Express by helicopter on December 14, 1953, another of the many firsts this company has recorded. As you notice on the logo, Siempre Primero, always first. Passenger service followed on November 22, 1954. The larger Sikorsky S-55 was used and became the first helicopter certificated for scheduled passenger transportation. This period represented, according to Belinn, the pioneering or get-ready phase of his airline. The real beginning came on March 1, 1962, when the new Sikorsky S-61 went into service. This 28-passenger twin-turbine workhorse has already earned the affectionate title of a DC-3 without wings. Here we have a picture of the S-62, the single-turbine engine, when it was first placed into service to train LA Airways crews in the operation of jet turbine-powered engines. That's Mr. Clarence Belinn, president and founder of LA Airways. Mr. Belinn in the center. As most of you know, I started my airline career with Los Angeles Airways. When I was in high school, I took a course with Weaver Airline School and launched my career with the airlines with Los Angeles Airways. Mr. Belinn had a firm rule that no one could be hired until they'd had an executive interview with him. And so I left Kansas City before graduating from the airline school. I had about 2 or 3 days to go with 2 appointments for interviews, one in Los Angeles with Los Angeles Airways and another in San Francisco with San Francisco-Oakland Helicopter. I didn't know that San Francisco-Oakland Helicopter had, the executives had started with LA Airways and had broken away to start their own helicopter airline in San Francisco. Dick Epping, the station manager of Los Angeles International Airport, interviewed me and said, yes, I'd like to start, but you must have an interview with the president of the company. So I had my interview with Mr. Belinn, and he says, well, I can't really put you on as a ticket agent. However, you come back in 3 days, I have an interview with a man named Bob Hubley, and he's our passenger traffic manager, and I'm sure he can find a spot for you. And I told him, well, I'm running a little low on finances. I really can't afford to stick around another 2 or 3 days. I have an interview up in San Francisco. So he says, well, I'll tell you what. He says, if this guy Hubley doesn't hire you, he says, I'll pay for your lodging. So I says, well, what do I have to lose? I'll be back Friday. So I came back and had my interview with Bob Hubley on Friday, and I started out as a traffic representative. These photographs we've been looking at are pictures Bob Hubley took before I started working with Los Angeles Airways. They were various shots of our heliports. As you can see, they were very primitive in nature. This was our first operation in Disneyland, and this is where we spent many, many years. And here's the arrival of the Sikorsky S-61. This photograph was taken the second day after we took delivery. Nice, beautiful, clear day. This photograph's hung on the wall for too many years and has faded. This is outside United's Terminal 7, and this is the tram service that would come by and pick up our passengers. It's our Los Angeles Airways bag tags. And here's a first day mail cover sent from LA International to San Bernardino. It's the back side of our ticket stock, annual passes. Here's a letter written to me from Clarence Belinn from the Office of the President. We always had to have the green ink, and this is the Anaheim heliport before it was enlarged. This was probably 1961, 62, somewhere in that neighborhood. In the 1964 air transport world, we had a 3-page article, and it was entitled, "That's Me in My First Uniform," and here is Richard Burton getting off the helicopter with Liz and Mike Minear, of course. This was a billboard that we had in the San Fernando Valley. That's our schedule and our route system. This was after the introduction of the Twin Otter. And here's a better photograph of the S-61, put out by a little pamphlet put out by Sikorsky. Here's the article I'm going to read to you now. Pioneering is over for LAA with introduction of Sikorsky S-61. The pioneering is behind us, and now we can develop our market. With this remark, Los Angeles Airways President Clarence M. Belinn pretty well summed up the history and future plans of his company. While there is an air of optimism around the LA Airways general offices, it doesn't take much digging to find a heavy overcast of frustration and uncertainty as a result of the present subsidy cutback which now confronts the helicopter operators. After a little over 2 years' experience with the S-61, Belinn has some impressive figures to back his contention that his company is now past the shakedown period and is ready to exploit the rapid expanding and congested Southern California market. For the point of this discussion, LAA's fleet consists of 4 S-61s with another scheduled for delivery in April of '65. During this 2-year period, a great deal of time was spent on modifications and maintenance procedures which have been of considerable value to the military. The problems facing Los Angeles Airways as 1964 fades out are staggering. A temporary certificate of public convenience and necessity that expires on December 31st, 1964, some outspoken critics of all helicopter operators in Congress, and a big question mark as to what the CAB will do about the subsidy question in the months ahead. LA Airways received a lot of praise in 1958, and the traffic was up 5-fold in 3 years. With the S-61, the picture has changed. In 1961, LAA carried 42,608 passengers. In 1963, with S-61s, 171,427 passengers were carried, and 1964 should come close to 250,000. This scene here is shot from outside the building, our cramped quarters in Anaheim. There is no doubt that the S-61 has been well accepted by the traveling public, and after spending a little time aloft, we think the answer can be summed up in 2 words: convenience and dependability. For example, a deplaning passenger arrives at Los Angeles International Airport, final destination San Bernardino. He has his choice of 9 flights daily during the week, fewer on weekends, with departures about 2 hours apart. Take Flight 227, leaving Los Angeles at 9:30 a.m. Some LAAN vacations are obviously during the loading the air stair door and the sliding drawer type baggage pods, which can be preloaded with 600 pounds of baggage, slid into the cargo compartment to replace the pod just arriving. Well, unfortunately that never quite worked, but it was a good theory and concept. When the flight is called, 28 passengers board and fasten themselves in comfortable side-by-side seats. A neat young man, a combination ramp agent and flight attendant, closes the air stair door and the flight is ready to go. It is at this point the first rider gets acquainted with the capabilities of the S-61. It taxis a short distance to the takeoff area, and if you happen to glance at your watch, you will look out the large picture window and find you have gone straight up several hundred feet, and you wonder how it happened. The S-61 cruises at about 130 miles per hour, and one thing is immediately obvious: the low noise level in the cabin. A landing is made at Riverside at 10:06 a.m. on schedule. Passengers Mail and Express are offloaded during the ground time of 30 seconds and then straight up and away again. Since San Bernardino is a turnaround, 0.3 minutes ground time is allowed. The engines are not cut during stops, and this saves more time. LAA has worked closely with the cities it serves in building heliports. The city generally provides the land on a long-term lease, and LAA makes the installation at an average cost of $25,000. Each heliport consists of a surfaced landing area 200 by 400 feet and a suitable terminal building. The entire area is fenced. While there are many good heliports in the area, many more are needed, and plans are going ahead to open new areas in the immediate future. Anaheim, the pictures you've been looking at here, was the world's busiest heliport. In fact, we carried more passengers in and out of Anaheim than we did some carriers, some airports that had single service carriers, 438 airports that size. We're viewing now the funeral of Jack Dupies, pilot of the first helicopter that crashed. Here we have a helicopter flyby. Unfortunately, over LA Airways history, we had two unfortunate crashes. The first crash was never fully determined. It was a problem with blade tracking, and we never were able to actually find all of the parts to accurately determine the cause. The second crash was caused by due to lack of shot pinning one of the pins that holds in the helicopter blades, and it threw a rotor blade. So of course with the rotor blade thrown, there's not much chance of an aircraft landing. This is a scene in Anaheim of our two-ship operation. Looks like a real drizzly morning. This is the cockpit of the S-61 looking out towards the Disneyland Hotel. It's another landing at Anaheim. This is the new paint job after we suffered the first crash to try to give a new image of LA Airways. Here we go, off to LA International. During the period of time Los Angeles Airways operated in and out of Anaheim, we carried more than 1 million passengers. That's a lot of 28-passenger trips. Some of the trips were turnarounds. They just came in from LA and turned around. Other trips extended on to Newport Beach. Here we have the operation of LA Airways at Newport Beach and President Nixon's Marine One helicopter. LA Airways tried for many years to get an instrument landing approach into Newport Beach. Funny thing, after Mr. Nixon bought the San Clemente house, Marine One was able to get instrument landing rights into Newport within 6 weeks. Of course, LA Airways benefited from this. Fred Milam, our Vice President of Transportation, now retired, living in San Diego, tells me that the Sikorsky S-61 helicopter was designed in the 60s, and it's planned to be used in service through the year 2000. S-61 is definitely a safe aircraft, and LA Airways pioneered many features that the military adopted. It's very unfortunate that subsidy was taken away from LA Airways at an inappropriate time. To show you how the S-61 is still in use today, we're going to switch now to President Reagan's recent departure from Washington. Here's the Secret Service in Newport watching the arrival of President Nixon. And I believe President Nixon is going to deplane from the aircraft at this point. And there's Mr. Nixon. Off to San Clemente. We never really knew Mr. Nixon's schedule, President Nixon then, and unfortunately he always seemed to come in when we had a scheduled trip to come in, and our helicopter had to circle, of course, and wait for Nixon's to leave.
That's one of the Secret Service agents, and these people, of course, are so close to the first family. Nice moment, an exchange of salutes from these two men. Roughly the former president. We've got to keep changing all these designations. This is such a familiar sight of the Reagan years, and Ronald and Mrs. Reagan walking to the helicopter, reporters shouting their questions, the president raising his hands or cupping his ear and saying just exactly what he wanted to say.
The plan is for Marine One to get aloft and circle. We had heard once, we had heard twice, but very briefly, and then proceed on out to Andrews, and then directly on out to California.
On board going back today to California will be, among others, Stuart Spencer, who ran the Van Quayle campaign this time and ran Ronald Reagan's first campaign, 1966, the governor of California, an old and canny hand at this business of getting Ronald Reagan and Republicans elected, and he's been invited to ride out there today, among other close personal and political friends of the first family. Whether Ronald Reagan will, as he promises, speak out about some issues that he feels strongly about. The line item veto for presidents of the United States. He thinks that a president ought to be able to go into a budget and say, I don't like that, I'm going to veto it, and you're going to have to override it. Also the 22nd Amendment.
I was going to say, limiting a president to 2 terms, it's always been his conviction that the American people should be able to elect whoever they want for as many times as they want. Catch the moment. Was Mrs. Quayle's hat a casualty just there of the wash?
It might have been. Ronald Reagan circles the nation ways, but he's also looking down on a city in which the problem of the homeless is visible to every visitor here, where in too many neighborhoods there is far too much violence, almost all of it drug-related. Many of the street corners in the poor neighborhoods, little more than open-air markets for crack and cocaine and hard drugs. It's a city of contradictions, as we say, of triumphs and achievements, disappointments, but also failures.
As he rides off, a little bit of foreign reaction. Pravda on Ronald Reagan's leaving credits him with becoming more of a realist in his terms. The Japan Times, we are told, calls him a man of the decade. And the other end of the spectrum, too, in Nicaragua, they're planning street parties to celebrate his departure.
Statuary Hall in the Capitol. The Reagans wing their way toward Andrews Air Force Base. Joe Cocker, among others.
He's a pretty good player.
Yeah.
Again, the aircraft is Air Force One, but it has a special designation for this flight, Special Air Mission, designated SAM, which will carry the President and former President and Mrs. Reagan and a small party. And we can see Marine One.
It's about 45 minutes by car to Andrews Air Force Base, which is just outside of Washington, as you know.
We don't want to miss a moment of that, but just before it lands, let's see if we can get in some more letters to President Reagan from some of the youngsters that we had asked to pass a message along. These are some of his going-away notes.
Reagan, you've accomplished so much.
And Ronald Reagan is about to bid farewell to Washington, D.C. That's the helicopter that has borne him and Mrs. Reagan in a final tour of the Capitol from the air. Now they're at Andrews Air Force Base, about to get on the airplane that will take them back to California 8 years after they arrived here, to a good deal of skepticism from the political establishment. People who still have real disputes with the way Ronald Reagan went about his business and what he was able to do, but they will all concede that he did touch the hearts, certainly the voting hands of the American public in a way that few other presidents in this century have. He goes out with a 64% approval rating, which is quite extraordinary.
And kept his hair.
And kept his hair.
I couldn't let that one pass. You've accomplished more than most people, and you still have your hair.
I have been covering Ronald Reagan since 1966, and people always say to me, he's got to dye his hair, and he's got to wear makeup. But the fact is, on close examination on a number of occasions, I can tell you, I don't believe that. I think that is the color of Ronald Reagan's hair, and if you look at Moon Reagan's head of hair, it's the same thing, and he's a couple of years older than Ronald Reagan. That is his brother Neil. I mean, healthy genes in that regard. He told me the other day that he's been working out on the Nautilus machines as well, and he really is in rock solid shape.
Out at Andrews Air Force Base as the President arrives on Marine One is correspondent Tom Pettit. Tom?
Bryant, Marine One has landed here, bringing Mr. and Mrs. Reagan, the former President and the former First Lady, for their final departure from Andrews Air Force Base. This airport outside Washington, where they embarked on so many historic trips to China, to Europe, to the beaches of Normandy. And now, as they say, Mr. Reagan goes to California. This will be a very low-key ceremony here at the airport. There's a crowd of a few neighbors from around Andrews Air Force Base, mostly the families of military servicemen. We have a Marine Corps band. We have some troops representing all the various military agencies. And Mr. Reagan will review them. This will be his final walk from Marine One to what was called Air Force One and is for this trip called Executive One. This is a happy departure for them. It may be the first happy departure for an ex-president in some years. After all, President Carter left in defeat, President Ford left in defeat, President Nixon left in disgrace, and so did President Johnson. So this is unusual in recent American history for there to be a happy celebration for an outgoing President of the United States who has served 2 full terms. Mr. and Mrs. Reagan are going to a small podium where she will watch while he walks among the troops, reviews the troops.
It was here the other day that the president had a very emotional farewell to all the branches of the military. In fact, he said at the conclusion, "I think I'm going to cry." I think they're cold. I think it's both a touching moment and a chilly one.
It's quite windy out there. The temperatures have dipped into the 40s, but it does get very windy.
Careful inspection.
Now the former president will review the troops after what I've always thought was one of the most stirring sights in Washington. Air Force One standing out against a dark gray sky, a military band playing the Star-Spangled Banner, and little flags waving. It's just marvelous. And this is a moment in American history because we're watching a phenomenon known as Ronald Reagan say goodbye to the nation's capital. Each of the services has been represented here by a small detachment. Marine Corps Band. The President and the American military have had a long affinity for each other, and this is only symbolic of it today. He is, so far as we know, the only modern American president to use the military salute. This is the last formal occasion for Ronald Reagan in Washington, D.C., ending the 8 years of the Reagan era. Now he's going to return to the small platform to rejoin Mrs. Reagan. Then they will board the plane for the 5-hour trip to Los Angeles, where as private citizens they will go home tonight in Belinn, California.
Get a better shot. How far did you do it?
Yes, sir.
Shall we go, he said.
Reagan, who made red such a fashionable color, is dressed in her color as she leaves today. In fact, women reporters at the White House took to wearing red at news conferences because they thought that the president would spot them more readily, and in fact he did. It got to be a kind of an inside joke.
Tom, did it
John
seem...
Harrington, who's the Energy Secretary, saying goodbye. King Charles Terrier, is that what they're called?
Look, Maureen Reagan was saying this morning what the dogs are going to miss most when they go into retirement is the big lawn.
Yeah.
Look out the backyard and wonder what happened. Really is a remarkable sight when you think of how men cling to power around the world to watch a peaceful transfer amid such pomp and ceremony and good feelings. It's quite remarkable.
Rex the dog. Kingly name for a dog that has lived in a kingly way.
We're going to get a lot of dogs in the White House very soon, right? And I do believe the Bush's dog is Bush puppy.
Into Air Force One, where the living accommodations are very good for the president and the first lady, but the rest of the staff and folks, it's cramped in there. I've flown on it on long flights, and at the back there's not a lot of space, and you get stewards and security people and attendants of all kinds. And because the middle part of the airplane is so taken up with the president's quarters, and a lot of room for everyone else, but it's a great thrill to be
I was going to say, look at the bright side. It is an on-time airline.
That's right, and you don't have to worry about your luggage at the other end and all of those matters. And while we watch this now, as Air Force One gets ready to taxi out, let's hear from some children around the country who had some parting thoughts for President and Mrs. Reagan. Youngsters around the country expressing their affection for Ronald Reagan, youngsters from every corner of the country, ethnic background, no doubt representing Democratic families as well as Republican.
Waiting for them to close the door on Air Force One, not quite closing the door on the Reagan years, but and that's it.
And it will be left. Always a majestic shot, as Tom Pettit indicated a few moments ago. This plane that has circled the globe, searched the various missions of President and Mrs. Reagan, and it is the plane as well that will carry George Bush, and we expect him to be a traveling president almost instantly. He's already said that he'll go February 24th to the funeral. They worry that it might get in the way of George Bush, and they think that that may not be fair. They think that George Bush should have his own agenda for a time. Journey that began in the small towns of Illinois, small college of Eureka, broadcasting jobs in Davenport, Iowa, and Des Moines, Hollywood in the late 30s, then television and politics in the grandest way possible. 2 terms as governor of California, 2 terms as president of the United States.
In March 23, 1965, Mr. Belinn wrote a letter to all employees. The editorials attached are self-explanatory and should be of interest to everyone. Moreover, in my opinion, they reflect the facts accurately. The administration's view seems to be that subsidized helicopter services provide a premium service to relatively few people, and in only their areas. Consequently, the passenger should pay for the service. LAA service is tailored to the unique characteristics of Southern California, which dictates the need for a short-haul feeder type of service which cannot command premium fares. Consequently, a modest federal support is justifiable, at least during the years of pioneering new equipment and procedures. Our position on this has been made clear to everyone. At the recent hearing before the Senate Subcommittee on Aviation, strong support for LAA was voiced by our good friend Governor Brown. Personal appearances were made by our longtime friend Senator Thomas Kuechel and by our new Senator George Murphy. Congressman Kenneth Dial, speaking on behalf of the Southern California Democratic delegation, made the position clear for the many outlying cities and congressional districts. In addition, all the counties, cities, chambers of commerce, and many users were heard from. Senator Maroney made it clear that if all three of the operators made their views known, as Mr. Dial did, this could represent 25% of the House of Representatives, which in my opinion could have a determinative effect if coupled with the many cities and areas not now receiving service, but who were known to feel that their needs are not being considered adequately by the CAB. After the two crashes, and to compete with the service that the air commuter services that started up, LA Airways inaugurated a Twin Otter service. And after the demise of LA Airways in October 7th, 1970, I worked for some time in the electronics industry, and then accepted a position with Golden West Airlines. I commuted for 6 months to Ontario, and then spent 22 days trying to refurbish the Anaheim heliport. I think we did a real good job of giving Anaheim a new look. Here's a picture of Golden West operating LA Airways Sikorsky S-61s in and out of Anaheim. In October 1st, 1970, Mr. Belinn wrote a letter to the stockholders saying that your management regrets to advise that Mr. Howard Hughes has failed to meet his commitment to purchase the assets of LAA at a price which would net $8 per share to the stockholders. Hughes first approached your management to purchase the assets of LAA in the fall of 1968. A proposal was tendered and conditionally accepted. Hughes subsequently requested that the transaction be temporarily held in abeyance until certain other matters had been consummated by Hughes. That's a picture of Miss Anaheim and one of Golden West flight attendants. And here again, we still had our two-ship operation. These photographs have been submitted by Byron LeCompte. Here's another view of Anaheim, and here's a view of the flight attendants. Continuing, in May of 1970, Hughes affirmed his agreement to purchase the assets of LAA. Written evidence of the agreement was drawn up by the parties which set forth the terms and conditions of the purchase of the assets of LAA by Hughes or an entity controlled by him. The CAB was advised that Hughes and LAA had reached an agreement that approval of a loan of $4 million to be made by Hughes to LAA would be sought forthwith because of the critical financial condition of LAA, and that coupled with this request would also be a request for approval of the CAB of the acquisition of the assets of LAA by Hughes. Thereafter, counsel for LAA, at the request of Hughes' attorney, met with the executive officers of both United Airlines and American Airlines and obtained their consent for a waiver of certain rights to stock of LAA under their loan agreements with LAA. An announcement of the purchase of the assets of LAA by Hughes was then jointly prepared for publication. On May 25th, Hughes requested that the announcement be withheld for 24 hours pending determination of the amount and character of a supersedes bond to be set on Hughes' appeal of the TWA judgment in a New York federal court. After repeated inquiries by your management, Hughes has not consented to public release of the announcement nor signed the documentary evidence of his agreement to purchase the assets of LAA. As of the date of this letter, Hughes has refused to meet his commitments to LAA and its stockholders, and consequently your board of directors has instructed counsel to take appropriate legal action against Hughes to recover all damages sustained by LAA and its stockholders. Additionally, your board of directors and your president are presently of the opinion that the company will have to file a petition for reorganization under Chapter 10 of the Bankruptcy Act within the next week. Of course, we intended to continue operations under Chapter 10. However, on October the 20th, a letter was issued to the stockholders and employees of Los Angeles Airways Incorporated stating, on October 7, 1970, your company was ordered to suspend operations by the receiver in bankruptcy appointed by the Federal District Court. Despite this, it is the firm resolve of management and employees to continue to provide Southern California with an effective commuter feeder airline, and with your assistance, this can be accomplished. Without attempting to fix the blame, your company's current difficulties can be traced back to 1965 when the Civil Aeronautics Board maneuvered LAA into accepting a permanent certificate in exchange for having its subsidy eligibility cut off. Your company strongly resisted this and maintained that developmental assistance was vital if Los Angeles Airways was to continue to develop advanced forms of air transportation and provide a return on investments to its stockholders. Golden West was very much interested in LA Airways certificate, and a lot of work and money was put into refurbishing the S-61s. All new interiors were put in, the heliports were refurbished, and Golden West operated the helicopters for 125 days. At the end of those 125 days, new ruling was put out that air taxi operators could operate equipment in excess of 25,000 pounds, and Golden West no longer needed LA Airways certificate. So the helicopters were then turned back to the bankruptcy court, and some of them were used in the Forestry Service. Now this is part of the competition that we had to deal with. This is a demonstration by Aero Commuter, who was eventually gobbled up by Golden West, of a short takeoff and landing field they proposed near the Anaheim Stadium, and they're actually landing and taking off in the Anaheim Stadium parking lot. Of course, these are takeoffs are with no passengers on board, and so they actually they're exaggerating the capabilities of a de Havilland Twin Otter. This is some very poor footage of my days working for Golden West in Fullerton, a scheduled trip coming in. I enjoyed my time with Golden West, and particularly the seaplane operation. 3 times in my airline career I had to get a weather certificate, first with LA Airways, and then after a prolonged strike with the pilots, my license expired, and I had to take the test again to get it renewed. And then after LA Airways bankruptcy, Golden West required me to get a weather certificate again, and I actually trained Golden West employees in passing the test. The operations in Catalina required weather observations to be taken. That was more of a realistic takeoff, the capabilities with Twin Otter on a warm afternoon. This is in Santa Ana, Orange County. And there's yours truly driving an electric cart with quite a load of luggage. Golden West loads never really quite equaled LA Airways. Of course, 18-passenger Twin Otters couldn't really carry the traffic that the 28-passenger Sikorskys could. Twin Otter was very limited in irregular operations. I can remember working in Ontario one Christmas Eve, worked many flights, and they all came in with full loads of passengers and no luggage. It was one miserable Christmas season. Here we're firing up a left engine of the Twin Otter. Bob Hubley, LA Airways Vice President of Sales, was one of the first to obtain joint fares with various airlines. Our first agreement was with United Airlines, and it was a real breakthrough in developing additional revenue from the connecting carriers. 94% of LA Airways traffic was interline traffic. Sale efforts by all the airlines serving Los Angeles were reflected consistently increasing passenger revenues. In honor of the new joint fare with United Airlines, United designated November of 1964 as Helicopter Month and backed it up with system-wide interline training sessions, advertising and sales promotion programs. All four of the country's helicopter operators, Chicago, New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, participated in the promotional activities. Mr. Belinn felt at the time he submitted the article to Air Transport World of 1964 that Los Angeles Airways was capable of a subsidy-free operation within just a few years if present trends continued. LA Airways did a lot of work for NASA, and Boyd Kesselring, I hope, will be able to submit some photographs or some information anyway on the work LA Airways did with NASA. This is some very poor film footage of Golden West seaplane operation. LA Airways had applied for service to Catalina with a heliport. If LA Airways had been able to work out all the details with Catalina Island Company, who has very strict control of the island, we could have carried tremendous loads to and from Catalina. This shot was probably a pretty rare shot that won't see ever again. This was while I was working for Golden West. This is Hughes Air West, who was my next employer after leaving Golden West. This is a picture of one of their Fairchild F-27s, which goes back to some of Hughes Air West predecessor companies. This is probably an old Bonanza Fairchild. Hughes Air West was a combination of Pacific Airlines, Bonanza, and West Coast Airlines. F-27 had a distinctive high-pitched whine. We could always tell when one was coming in. It was very hard on the ears. And here's some more very bad footage of operations of the Twin Otter in Orange County. Worked for Golden West for about 2 years, about 1972 to 1974.
The modern helicopter. Sleek, fast, expensive. Powered by 2 jet engines, sophisticated machines like this Sikorsky S-76 pay for themselves by ferrying busy executives from city center to city center. They're easy to fly, too. My name is Les Morris. In 1941, I joined Sikorsky Aircraft as the first full-time helicopter test pilot. This cockpit looks formidable with its radar, automatic flight control systems, navigation systems, but very little has changed in the basic control system that Igor Sikorsky conceived. To understand how it works, let's go back to where it all started. It began here, alongside the Housatonic River in Stratford, Connecticut. The date was September 14th, 1939. Mr. Sikorsky's invention sprang from an idea that he had had since childhood when he first became fascinated with the concept of vertical flight. You've probably played with a toy like this, and you know that if you spin it in the horizontal plane, it will rise and descend vertically. Tilt it to the right, it'll fly to the right. Tilt it to the left, it'll fly to the left. Forward, backward. That is the basic concept of helicopter control. The problem was how to accomplish the tilting of the main rotors. Sikorsky's design of the VS-300 helicopter introduced cyclic pitch control for the first time in a single main rotor helicopter. It's still the type of control that's used almost entirely, or perhaps entirely, in all helicopters throughout the world. Cyclic pitch control can be described perhaps this way. You've driven down the highway at highway speeds and put your hand out the window and had fun tilting it up. It would climb up. Tilt it down, it would dive down. The same thing is done with cyclic pitch control with these main rotor blades. The blades, as they turn, are caused to dive down at one point and climb up at the opposite point. That tilts the entire rotor. If the dive down is forward, the rotor tilts forward and the ship flies forward. Back, the ship flies back, sideways, and so on. It's a very important type of control because it has simplified the operation of helicopters throughout the world. And it was done first on this little VS-300 helicopter. The pilot has in front of him a stick called the cyclic stick, and whichever way he moves that stick, the helicopter will tilt, forward, backward, or sideways. But how does he get the helicopter in the air in the first place? Beside him, in his left hand, there is a collective pitch control lever. We've talked about the cyclic pitch where the blades change their pitch in the cycle. The collective pitch lever changes the pitch of all the blades together or collectively. And naturally, the higher the pitch, the more the helicopter will rise in the air. At the end of the collective pitch lever, there is a throttle control device, usually in the form of a motorcycle-type throttle grip. The pilot will adjust his engine speed by turning the throttle until he gets the proper speed for takeoff, and then he will pull up on the collective pitch lever, and the ship will rise off the ground. To come back down and land, he reverses the procedure. He lowers the collective pitch lever and maintains proper engine speed, of course, by adjusting the throttle as necessary. The second control that I want to mention is the rudder or steering control. That is accomplished by a tail rotor like this. The tail rotor pushes or pulls the tail of the ship from one side to the other, depending on pilot control. The pilot controls the tail rotor by using conventional rudder pedals, like a standard airplane. Right rudder is a right turn, left rudder is a left turn. That's the way the pilot controls that portion of the tail rotor. But the tail rotor performs another very important function. When the engine is mounted in the fuselage and drives the main rotors in one direction, it wants to drive the fuselage in the opposite direction. The tail rotor compensates for that torque, and therefore it is often called the anti-torque rotor. Now I've covered the three main controls of the helicopter: the cyclic pitch control for handling the attitude of the ship, tilting it forward, backward, and sideways; the collective pitch control for raising the ship and lowering it, and the rudder pedals for turning the ship in one to the right or to the left. In the beginning, there were problems to be solved. Mr. Sikorsky and Serge Gluharev were the first pilots to try to fly the Sikorsky VS-300 in 1939 and 1940. Notice the very erratic way that the helicopter bounces around, and notice particularly how the pilot in these pictures, Serge Gluharev, is pumping the cyclic stick in his right hand, trying to maintain control of things. As you can see, the early cyclic pitch control did not work very well. And on December 9th, 1939, a gust of wind rolled the ship over on its side and it cracked up. Serge, the pilot at the time, was not injured. After that accident, Mr. Sikorsky and his little band of engineers decided temporarily to discontinue the cyclic pitch control and go to some other means of controlling the machine. After all, there are other means of control. For instance, you can tilt the entire ship and the rotor will follow. But how to tilt the entire ship? They came up with this as one possible arrangement and put it into practice. They put two horizontal tail rotors, small ones, on outriggers out at the tail of the machine, and by raising the pitch of those tail rotors, raising the bite and increasing the pitch, the ship would fly forward. By decreasing the pitch, the ship would tilt rearward and fly rearward. Decrease the pitch on one side and raise it on the other side, and the ship would fly sideward and back the other way. They decided to try this arrangement first with the machine mounted on a swiveling stand on the ground without having the main rotor installed at all. Here you see Mr. Sikorsky testing it out, and it seemed to work fairly well. This type of control was put into operation in March of 1940. By May 1940, the control was good enough and the pilots skilled enough, the pilots being Mr. Sikorsky and Serge, so that the first public demonstration was made. Mr. Sikorsky did the flying. But as you can see here, the control was still very uncertain, and from time to time the pilot would have to slap the ship back on the ground and start over again. It was finally decided that the problems were caused by the main rotor in forward flight driving the air down over these horizontal tail rotors and upsetting their operation. After all, the ship could fly backward very well, could fly sideward very well, but the problems developed in forward flight. Some weeks later, after many more successful flying days, Mr. Sikorsky was testing the craft in forward flight to analyze the troubles that began at speeds of 30 to 40 miles per hour. As he was making a run about 20 feet above the ground, one of the tail outriggers gave way and folded upward. The craft rolled over in the air and fell sideways in a tangled mass of wreckage. One of the mechanics who was there at the time said Mr. Sikorsky pulled himself from the debris and stood for a long minute looking it over. Then he said in quiet finality, "I think we'll get her home now." Still, this same arrangement was retained for a year. The tail rotor outriggers were made longer. They were raised to try to get the rotors out of the downwash from the main rotor. And in May 1941, Mr. Sikorsky flew this same arrangement to bring the world helicopter endurance record to America, hovering for 1 hour, 32 minutes, 25.1 seconds. A few days after Mr. Sikorsky performed that record-breaking flight, I had my first opportunity to fly the VS-300 in this arrangement. The problems in forward flight were still there, and perhaps it was just as well. It gave me lots of time to learn how to hover the ship and how to back up and how to turn on a spot. But I didn't have any more luck flying forward than Mr. Sikorsky or Serge did. At one point, since it flew so well backward, someone suggested that we might solve our problems by turning the pilot's seat around. But that idea didn't last very long. After a couple of months, it became obvious that we were going to have to make some major changes if we were going to have a truly flyable helicopter. In a corner of the engineering building, Mr. Sikorsky and his staff were already designing and beginning to build the first Sikorsky helicopter for the U.S. Army Air Corps. It was called the XR-4. It was scheduled to fly in January of 1942, but we had a lot of work to do if we could hope to fly it well. So early in the summer of 1941, the decision was made to return to cyclic pitch control in the VS-300 helicopter. It would be so much simpler than having those awkward and cumbersome tail rotor outriggers. We would try to do it in two stages. First, we would get rid of the outriggers, of course. Then we would use cyclic pitch control just for the lateral control of the machine, rolling it left and right. And for longitudinal control, we would use a single horizontal tail rotor mounted on a tower high above the tail, well out of the downwashed air from the main rotor. And it worked. Not right away. In early August, we rolled the machine out with this new arrangement, and there were a lot of adjustments and changes to be made. But on August 14th, 1941, remember that date, we suddenly discovered in one day that we had a completely flyable helicopter, all in one day. We had taken her across the street to the Stratford Airport, and I got in, started it up, checked her out, checked the controls, everything seemed fine. Took it up into a hover, checked again, everything was in good shape. Began maneuvers, little gentle maneuvers fore and aft, ran into no problems. Sideways, everything was clear. And finally began making figure-8 turns right out here at the airport. Making those turns into the wind at higher and higher speeds, up to an estimated 60 to 70 miles an hour. Quick stops from those speeds into a hover, back up, and no problems developed. After I came down and landed and got out of the ship, Serge Gluareff came over to me, threw out his arms and said, "Les, I could kiss you." We all felt the same way because we realized that in that one day, we had witnessed the dawn of the helicopter era. But a big question still remained. The Army helicopter, the XR-4, our first Army helicopter, was scheduled to fly in the middle of January. Could we get rid of that awkward tail tower and horizontal tail rotor by going back to full cyclic pitch control? So the beautiful, flyable little VS-300 was once again torn apart. The tail tower was removed and the rotor hub was realigned for full cyclic pitch control. On December 8th, 1941, the day that the United States declared herself at war with Japan, we rolled the ship out for the first trials. It had the controls now so that not just lateral control was cyclically controlled, but also fore and aft. It was full cyclic pitch control, similar to what would be used on the XR-4, the new aircraft that was scheduled to come off the line in January. I climbed into the seat, and with the engine warmed up, I began experimenting gently with this new control system. While far from perfect, the new controls were not showing any seriously undesirable characteristics. So I increased the pitch and throttle a little bit more and cleared the ground. Everything went well for perhaps 3 or 4 seconds. The ship started to drift a little bit sideways. I moved the control, and that introduced a rocking motion that increased rather severely, rather rapidly. So I set it back down on the ground. This introduced a question mark in my mind. I couldn't add any information to the observations that the engineers and Mr. Sikorsky had already made. So we had to back off and take some time to analyze what might be happening. Was it a problem in the rotor hub, in the rotor shaft, in the ship itself? We had to take time to analyze it. During the next week, several attempts were made to get back in the air. Ideas were as plentiful as balloons at a New Year's Eve party, and usually met the same results. Those that survived were given careful scrutiny and possibly a test in the aircraft. Nothing seemed to be resolving the problem. After 10, 15 seconds in the air, the same violent rocking would begin, and the ship would have to be slapped back down on the ground. As I became more used to the tossing around, I began to explore what might happen if I extended the flights. I started to try some slow forward flights, and I was surprised to find that the vibration did not increase. Then when I began to come to a stop from those forward flights, very slow forward flights, it got very severe, and I had to land very promptly. Investigations were the order of the day. Vibration specialists studied the natural frequencies of the rotor shaft, the fuselage, the landing gear. And finally, Mr. Sikorsky decided that it might be a question of the old blade dampers. The old oleo struts were recalled to active service, but they were installed at the rotor hub in such a way that they would damp the blades in the horizontal plane. Like a miracle from the Dark Ages, they turned the trick. Flights were made forward, backward, and sideward, and no wobble or resonance was detected. Thus, on the last day of 1941, the VS-300 demonstrated another completely satisfactory control system. The recapitulation for the year, written in the flight logbook, tells the story. During 1941, 3 totally different types of control were investigated on the VS-300 with a total flight time of 28 hours, 35 minutes, and 55 seconds. One more thing. Engines are not perfect. So what would happen if an engine quit while the helicopter is in the air? Would the rotor stop? Would the blades fold up? Would the ship fall like a brick? No. If that were to happen, you wouldn't get me more than 10 feet off the ground in a helicopter. There's a phenomenon called autorotation that enters the picture and keeps the rotor turning so that as the machine glides down, the pilot maintains complete control, except, of course, that he must come down. But he can guide the machine into any suitable landing spot within gliding distance. Autorotation got into the aviation picture in the early 1920s. It is generally credited to a Spanish engineer by the name of Juan de la Cierva. It had been discovered that an airplane without power glides forward. It doesn't just have to dive toward the ground. There's a forward thrust from its lift, even without power. Cierva began musing on that phenomenon and wondered what might happen if you were to whirl a wing through the air. He developed the autogyro. The autogyro has a rotating set of wings. It's drawn through the air by a propeller in the nose, and the rotor blades continue to turn due to the action of this forward thrust on the wing. The autogyro could fly much more slowly than an airplane and more safely. It could land and take off in much smaller spaces, but it could not hover. So its major contribution to the aircraft business was the development of autorotation. In the very early days at Sikorsky, we didn't fly high enough, 50, 75 feet above the ground at most, so that we didn't concern ourselves with evaluating autorotation. But early in 1942, with the XR-4 coming along for the Army and flying at higher altitudes, we had to approach the problem. After weeks of autorotation testing at the Stratford Airport, Frank Gregory came on from the U.S. Army at Wright Field and was flying with me to check progress. I was demonstrating autorotation glides, and at one point everything seemed so good that I turned to him and said, "Frank, I think I'll take her in." And he nodded his head, and I made an autogyro type landing, the first autorotation landings of a helicopter in this country. Frank had demonstrated autorotation landings in an autogyro at Wright Field, so that I developed the techniques under his guidance. My wife, Alice, says that her biggest rival over the years has been my love affair with the helicopter. And it has been, I confess, a love affair. Back in 1939, there was just a small band of supporters for Igor Sikorsky's concept. I was part of that small band. I recall vividly that Mr. Sikorsky predicted that this unique aircraft would one day save lives. And it gives me great pleasure to know that his prediction has been proved over 1 million times. From those early days when we would scratch our heads and try one solution after another until we found one that would work, to today, the principles that Igor Sikorsky pioneered still guide helicopter design. That makes me feel good. But if someone were to ask me what it is about helicopters that gives me the greatest satisfaction, I would have to answer that it's the knowledge that in spite of all that has happened with this unique aircraft so far, we have barely scratched the surface of its potential.